Picture this. You're standing in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Cleveland, watching snowflakes dance past the windows of the 32nd floor. You've just finished delivering the presentation of your career. 20 years of building client relationships, nurturing accounts that started as small local businesses and grew into million-dollar partnerships. Your laptop screen still glows with the final slide showing retention rates that would make any marketing firm weep with envy. 94% client renewal, the highest in company history. Your company history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The company you helped build from a scrappy startup in a converted warehouse to this gleaming tower with panoramic views of Lake Erie. You're feeling that warm glow of accomplishment, that moment when all your hard work crystallizes into undeniable numbers. Your team is nodding approvingly. Even the CFO, notorious for his poker face during quarterly reviews, is taking notes. You're thinking about the celebration dinner you'll have with your husband tonight. Maybe that little Italian place, where you had your first date 23 years ago. You're thinking about calling your daughter at Northwestern to share the good news. You're thinking about how far you've come since that terrified 25-year-old who walked into this company with nothing but a marketing degree and an unshakable belief that relationships matter more than algorithms. And then your new boss, the one who arrived 6 months ago with his MBA from an online program and his theories about digital transformation, stands up. He adjusts his Apple Watch, the expensive one that cost more than your first car, and clears his throat with the kind of authority that comes from having never actually built anything himself. "Before we adjourn," he says, and something in his tone makes the celebration die in your throat. "I need to address our organizational restructuring initiative." The words hit you like ice water. Restructuring. The corporate euphemism for we're about to destroy lives and call it progress. Your hand hovers over your laptop trackpad, finger trembling slightly as you realize that your moment of triumph is about to become your moment of devastation. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 45 years old, I thought I had figured out the rules of corporate survival. Work harder than everyone else. Deliver results that speak for themselves. Build relationships that last. Mentor the next generation. Keep your head down and let your performance do the talking. For 20 years, this strategy had served me well at Midwest Marketing Solutions. I had climbed from junior account coordinator to senior account director, earned the respect of clients and colleagues alike, and built a reputation as the person who could save any account relationship from disaster. I am the daughter of immigrants, who taught me that excellence was not negotiable and that persistence could overcome any obstacle. My parents, Dr. James Chen and Maria Chen, had arrived in Cleveland in the early 70s with medical degrees that meant nothing in America and determination that meant everything. My father spent 3 years working double shifts at a factory while studying for his medical licensing exams by lamplight in our tiny apartment. My mother cleaned office buildings at night and learned English by watching soap operas during the day until she could pass her nursing certification. They never complained, never made excuses, never expected anything to be handed to them. They simply worked until they earned their place in their new country. This work ethic was woven into my DNA like a genetic code I couldn't escape even if I wanted to. When other kids were at sleepovers, I was practicing violin and finishing homework 3 days early. When college friends were partying, I was working internships and building my resume. When my classmates were coasting through their first jobs, I was volunteering for the difficult clients and the impossible deadlines that nobody else wanted to touch. At Midwest Marketing Solutions, this approach had transformed me from an entry-level hire into an indispensable asset. I was the account director who could charm a hostile client into signing a 3-year extension. I was the mentor who turned nervous college graduates into confident professionals. I was the negotiator who could find middle ground when million-dollar deals hung in the balance. I was the institutional memory who remembered every client's Birthday, every company anniversary, every personal detail that turned business relationships into genuine partnerships. My office walls were covered with thank you notes from clients, photos from company events spanning 2 decades, and awards recognizing everything from outstanding client service to Employee of the Year. The brass nameplate on my desk read Sarah Chen, Senior Account Director, and beneath it sat a small framed quote my daughter had given me for my 40th birthday. It read, "Success is not about being irreplaceable. It's about being unforgettable." At the time, I thought it was just a sweet sentiment from a college kid who was proud of her mom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had no idea it would become my survival strategy. The conference room where my world was about to change overlooked the warehouse district where Midwest Marketing Solutions had started in 1995. Back then, we were 6 people in a converted shipping container, taking on local restaurants and small retailers who needed help getting noticed in an increasingly competitive marketplace. I could still remember the musty smell of that original office, the space heaters we used during Cleveland's brutal winters, and the champagne celebration when we landed our first $20,000 client. I had been employee number 12, hired 3 years later when the company had grown enough to need someone dedicated to client relationships. The founder, Michael Santos, was a brilliant strategist with zero patience for the emotional labor required to keep clients happy long-term. He could design campaigns that would make Madison Avenue executives jealous, but he couldn't remember to return phone calls or show up to meetings on time. He needed someone who understood that marketing was not just about creativity and analytics, but about trust and consistency and making people feel heard. That someone turned out to be me. Within 6 months of my arrival, client retention rates increased by 30%. Within a year, we were getting referrals from clients who had never referred anyone before. Within 2 years, I was managing accounts worth more than the entire company's previous annual revenue. I had found my calling in the intersection of strategic thinking and human connection, and Midwest Marketing Solutions had found their secret weapon for sustainable growth. Over the following 17 years, I had watched Cleveland transform from a Rust Belt afterthought into a legitimate tech hub. I had seen our tiny marketing firm grow into a regional powerhouse with offices in Columbus and Cincinnati. I had hired and trained 43 employees, many of whom had gone on to start their own successful companies. I had been present for 3 major acquisitions, 2 ownership transitions, and countless strategic pivots that kept us ahead of industry trends. Through it all, I had been the steady heartbeat that kept our client relationships strong, regardless of whatever internal chaos we were navigating. The relationships I had built were not just professional contracts, but genuine partnerships forged through years of problem-solving together. Margaret Harrison from Harrison Manufacturing had started as a skeptical small business owner with a $5,000 monthly budget and a deep distrust of marketing consultants. Through patience, transparency, and results that spoke louder than promises, I had helped her company grow into a $15 million operation with distribution channels across the Midwest. We had weathered economic downturns, industry disruptions, and family crises together. When her father passed away suddenly and left her scrambling to understand the financial side of the business, I had connected her with our accounting partners and helped her navigate the transition without missing a beat in her marketing strategy. James Morrison from Morrison Auto Group had been on the verge of bankruptcy when he first walked into our office 7 years earlier. His dealership was hemorrhaging money, his advertising was attracting the wrong customers, and his competitors were stealing market share with slick digital campaigns he couldn't afford to match. Instead of trying to sell him expensive solutions he couldn't afford, I had spent 3 weeks analyzing his operation and developing a grassroots strategy that played to his strengths. We focused on community engagement, customer service excellence, and word-of-mouth marketing that turned his existing customers into his most effective sales force. Today, Morrison Auto Group is the third largest dealership network in northeastern Ohio, and James calls me his guardian angel. These were not just business relationships built on quarterly reports and annual contracts. These were partnerships built on trust, mutual respect, and shared success over many years. My clients knew they could call me at 7 in the morning or 9 at night if they had a crisis. They knew I would remember their daughter's graduation or their son's wedding and send congratulations that had nothing to do with business development. They knew that when I made a recommendation, it was based on what was best for their company, not what was most profitable for mine. This approach had made me invaluable to Midwest Marketing Solutions, but it had also made me expensive. At 45, I was earning a salary that reflected 2 decades of proven results and relationship building that couldn't be replicated by artificial intelligence or automated systems. I was the human element in an industry increasingly obsessed with digital transformation and data-driven decision-making. I was the institutional memory that remembered why certain strategies worked and others failed. I was the bridge between old-school relationship marketing and new-school technological innovation. But I was also, according to Ryan Mitchell, a bottleneck standing in the way of progress. Ryan had joined Midwest Marketing Solutions 6 months earlier as Vice President of Operations, hired specifically to modernize our systems and prepare us for the next phase of growth. His resume was impressive on paper: MBA from a prestigious online program, 5 years of experience at a Silicon Valley startup that had burned through $40 million in venture capital before imploding spectacularly. Expertise in social, media marketing, influencer partnerships, and algorithmic customer acquisition strategies that promised to revolutionize how we approached client development. Michael Santos, our founder, had been gradually stepping back from day-to-day operations as he approached his 60th birthday. He wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren and less time worrying about quarterly projections and employee management. Hiring Ryan was supposed to give him the freedom to focus on high-level strategy while trusting someone else to handle operational details. It was a reasonable plan from a business succession standpoint, but it fundamentally misunderstood what made our company successful in the first place. From the moment Ryan arrived, it was clear that he viewed our established client relationships as assets to be optimized rather than partnerships to be nurtured. He spoke in buzzwords about customer lifetime value and acquisition cost ratios. He brought in expensive consultants who had never worked directly with clients but could build impressive dashboards showing engagement metrics and conversion funnels. He implemented new project management software that tracked every minute of billable time and generated reports that reduced human relationships to data points and profit margins. More troubling was his obvious discomfort with anyone who had been at the company longer than he had been alive in his professional life. During our first team meeting, he made a joke about learning from the dinosaurs before teaching us about modern marketing. Everyone laughed politely, but the message was clear. Experience was not an asset in Ryan's world. It was a liability that needed to be managed and eventually eliminated. The warning signs had been accumulating for months, but I had chosen to focus on my work rather than office politics. When Ryan started scheduling client strategy meetings without including me, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. When he began questioning campaign decisions I had been making successfully for years, I thought he was trying to learn our systems. When he brought in junior employees to shadow my client calls under the guise of professional development, I believed he was genuinely interested in knowledge transfer. I was wrong about all of it. The truth became undeniable 3 weeks before that fatal conference room meeting when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I had stayed late to prepare for a presentation to Morrison Auto Group, working on a campaign strategy that would position them for expansion into the Columbus market. The office was supposedly empty except for the cleaning crew, so I was surprised to hear voices coming from Ryan's corner office. The door was closed, but the glass walls that made our workspace feel open and collaborative also made private conversations impossible when people forgot to lower their voices. Ryan was on a video call with someone whose face I couldn't see clearly, but whose questions suggested they were either a consultant or potential investor evaluating our company structure. The conversation that I accidentally overheard would haunt me for weeks. The biggest inefficiency we're dealing with is legacy employees who are overcompensated for work that could be done by people half their age at half the cost, Ryan was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin glass. We have directors earning six-figure salaries when we could hire recent graduates with better technical skills for $40,000 a year. The clients won't know the difference as long as we maintain service quality through better systems and processes. The voice on the other end of the call asked about client relationships and whether there would be resistance to account transitions. Ryan's response made my blood freeze. Most of these relationships are held together by habit and nostalgia rather than actual value creation. Once we demonstrate superior results through data-driven strategies, clients will appreciate the improved efficiency. The emotional attachment to individual account managers is a weakness in our current model, not a strength. We need to build client loyalty to the company brand, not to specific employees who might leave or become too expensive to maintain. I stood in my darkened office, listening to my career being reduced to a line item on a cost-cutting spreadsheet. 20 years of relationship building dismissed as inefficiency. Decades of client loyalty characterized as emotional weakness. My expertise and institutional knowledge framed as obstacles to progress rather than assets to be leveraged. That night, I drove home through Cleveland's industrial district in a daze, past the steel mills and shipping yards that had built this city, and then watched it crumble and rebuild itself into something entirely different. I thought about my parents and the quiet dignity with which they had navigated professional disappointments and cultural obstacles that would have broken lesser people. I thought about my daughter, brilliant and idealistic at Northwestern, who believed that hard work and excellence would always be rewarded. I thought about my husband, who had supported every career decision I had made and trusted that I knew how to navigate corporate politics with the same skill I brought to client relationships. For the first time in my professional life, I realized that playing by the rules might not be enough to survive the game that was being played around me. Excellence and loyalty were not shields against strategic elimination. Relationships and results were not protection against cost-cutting initiatives driven by people who had never built anything lasting in their lives. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to wait for Ryan Mitchell to destroy what I had spent 20 years building. I was not going to let him rewrite the story of my career to fit his narrative about modernization and efficiency. I was not going to become a cautionary tale about experienced employees who failed to adapt to changing times. I was going to become the author of my own ending, and it was going to be far more interesting than anything Ryan Mitchell could imagine. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The conversation I had overheard the night before had stripped away any remaining illusions about my future at Midwest Marketing Solutions. Ryan Mitchell saw me as an expensive problem to be solved, not a valuable asset to be retained. If I was going to survive what was coming, I needed to stop thinking like an employee and start thinking like a strategist. I began my research during lunch breaks and quiet moments between client calls, diving deep into company policies that I had never needed to understand before. Our employee handbook was a thick binder that most people received on their first day and promptly forgot about, but I started reading it like scripture. Section by section, clause by clause, I mapped out the legal framework that governed my employment relationship with the company. What I discovered was fascinating and potentially powerful. Midwest Marketing Solutions had been founded during a different era of business, when employee retention was considered a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. The original handbook, written by Michael Santos himself back in 1998, contained generous provisions for long-term employees that reflected his philosophy about building a company culture based on loyalty and mutual investment. The severance policy was particularly interesting. For employees terminated without cause after 10 or more years of service, the company was required to provide 2 weeks of pay for every year of employment, plus all accumulated vacation time, plus any earned but unpaid bonuses from the current fiscal year. For someone with my tenure and performance record, this could represent a substantial financial commitment that the company might not be prepared to honor. But the real revelation came in Section 12.3.7, a subsection buried so deep in the handbook that I doubted anyone in current management had ever read it. The provision stated that involuntary termination of senior employees must include proportional distribution of annual performance bonuses based on fiscal year accomplishments to date. Since our company operated on a calendar year basis and paid performance bonuses in February based on the previous year's results, anyone terminated in the fourth quarter would be entitled to their full projected bonus regardless of whether they were employed when the actual payment was distributed. I pulled my performance reviews and bonus history from the past 5 years, calculating what my Q4 bonus projection would be based on the client retention numbers I had just presented. The figure was staggering. If Ryan terminated me in November or December, the company would owe me not just 20 weeks of severance pay, but also approximately $127,000 in performance bonus money. This discovery gave me leverage, but leverage was only useful if I knew how to apply it strategically. I needed to understand not just what the company owed me legally, but what my departure would cost them operationally. So I began documenting my client relationships with the same methodical approach I brought to campaign development. I created detailed files for each of my major accounts, tracking not just contract values and renewal dates, but also the personal relationships and institutional knowledge that kept these partnerships functioning smoothly. Margaret Harrison from Harrison Manufacturing, for example, had a daughter getting married in the spring and had already asked me to recommend a photographer from our vendor network. James Morrison from Morrison Auto Group was considering a major expansion into electric vehicle sales and had scheduled 3 strategy sessions with me for November to develop the marketing approach. Patricia Williams from Williams Financial Services was planning to retire in 2 years and wanted help positioning her firm for acquisition by a larger company. These were not just business relationships that could be transferred from one account manager to another with a simple email introduction. They were personal partnerships built on years of trust, shared success, and mutual understanding. My clients didn't just hire Midwest Marketing Solutions because of our creative capabilities or strategic expertise. They hired us because they trusted me to understand their businesses, remember their priorities, and provide honest counsel even when it wasn't what they wanted to hear. I realized that Ryan's fundamental misunderstanding of our business model was both a threat and an opportunity. He saw client relationships as fungible assets that could be managed by anyone with the right technical skills and software tools. But he was wrong, and his wrongness would become expensive very quickly if he tried to replace experienced relationship managers with inexperienced digital natives who had never learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when a client was frustrated, confused, or preparing to take their business elsewhere. My documentation project expanded beyond individual client relationships to include broader operational knowledge that existed nowhere in our company systems. I knew which vendors could deliver rush jobs when we had impossible deadlines. I knew which media contacts would take my calls at 6 a.m. when we needed crisis communication support. I knew which local business leaders could provide referrals when we were pitching competitive accounts. Most importantly, I knew the history behind every major strategic decision we had made as a company, including the failures that Ryan would inevitably repeat if he didn't learn from our institutional memory. While I was building my defensive capabilities, I also began exploring offensive options that could protect my interests regardless of what Ryan decided to do. The most intriguing possibility emerged from a conversation with my attorney about non-compete agreements and industry standards for client relationship management. Jennifer Walsh had been my family's lawyer for 15 years, handling everything from our mortgage documents to my daughter's college fund planning. She was exactly the kind of small business attorney who understood both the legal technicalities and practical realities of employment relationships. When I called her for advice about my situation at Midwest Marketing Solutions, she asked me to bring in my employment contract and any relevant company policies for review. Her analysis was enlightening and encouraging. The non-compete clause in my contract was narrowly written to prevent me from directly soliciting existing clients for 18 months after termination. However, there were no restrictions on clients reaching out to me independently, no prohibitions on me starting my own business in the same industry, and no limits on my ability to serve former clients if they initiated contact after my non-compete period expired. More importantly, Jennifer pointed out that non-compete agreements were increasingly difficult to enforce in Ohio, especially when the termination was initiated by the employer rather than the employee. Courts were reluctant to prevent people from earning a living in their chosen profession, particularly when they had been forced out of their previous position through no fault of their own. This legal framework gave me options that I hadn't previously considered. If Ryan did decide to terminate me, I wouldn't be trapped in employment limbo for 18 months while watching him destroy the relationships I had spent 20 years building. I could start my own firm, serve new clients in the same industry, and position myself to reconnect with former clients once the non-compete period expired. The possibility of entrepreneurship was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had never seriously considered leaving the security of corporate employment, but I had also never faced the prospect of being forced out by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the business we were in. Starting my own marketing consultancy would allow me to apply everything I had learned about relationship building and strategic thinking without the constraints of corporate bureaucracy or the interference of managers who prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term client satisfaction. I began researching the practical requirements for starting a marketing firm in Ohio, from business registration and licensing requirements to office space and professional insurance. The startup costs were manageable, especially if I received a substantial severance package that could provide financial cushioning during the early months of business development. The potential client base was encouraging, given the strength of my professional network and the likelihood that some current clients would be interested in working with me once they were legally allowed to do so. But I also realized that starting my own business would require more than just legal compliance and financial planning. I needed to develop a comprehensive strategy for client acquisition, service delivery, and operational management that could compete effectively with established firms like Midwest Marketing Solutions. This meant not just leveraging my existing relationships, but also building new capabilities that would differentiate my services in an increasingly competitive marketplace. I spent evenings and weekends developing what would eventually become the business plan for Chen & Associates Marketing. The strategic approach I outlined focused on relationship-driven marketing services for mid-sized companies that were too large for generic solutions, but too small for the attention of major advertising agencies. My target clients were businesses with annual revenues between $5 and $50 million that needed sophisticated marketing strategy, but also valued personal attention and long-term partnership over flashy campaigns and cutting-edge technology. The service offerings I designed emphasized strategic consulting, relationship marketing, and integrated campaign development that combined traditional and digital approaches based on each client's specific needs rather than industry trends or technological capabilities. Instead of trying to compete with agencies that specialized in social media marketing or influencer partnerships, I would position myself as the strategic advisor who could help companies navigate the increasingly complex marketing landscape, while maintaining focus on fundamental business objectives like customer acquisition, retention, and loyalty. This planning process revealed something important about my own professional identity that I hadn't fully understood before. For 20 years, I had defined myself primarily as an employee of Midwest Marketing Solutions, rather than as an independent marketing professional with portable skills and valuable expertise. I had allowed my sense of professional worth to become entangled with my role at one specific company, which made the threat of termination feel like an existential crisis rather than a career transition. But developing my business plan forced me to articulate my value proposition in terms that were independent of any particular employer. I was not just Sarah Chen, Senior Account Director at Midwest Marketing Solutions. I was Sarah Chen, Marketing, strategist with 20 years of experience helping mid-sized companies build sustainable growth through relationship-driven customer acquisition and retention strategies. My expertise belonged to me, not to any company, and my track record of success was portable regardless of where I chose to apply it. This shift in perspective was liberating and empowering in ways I hadn't anticipated. Instead of feeling like a victim of corporate restructuring, I began to see myself as an entrepreneur who had been subsidizing her market research and business development for 20 years while building the network and expertise necessary to launch a successful independent practice. Ryan Mitchell's cost-cutting initiative wasn't just a threat to my current employment. It was potentially the catalyst that would push me toward a more fulfilling and financially rewarding career path that I had been too comfortable to pursue on my own. The psychological transformation was as important as the practical preparation. I stopped feeling defensive about my age and experience, and started feeling confident about the competitive advantages that came with maturity and institutional knowledge. I stopped worrying about whether I could adapt to new technologies and started focusing on how I could help clients navigate technological change without losing sight of fundamental business principles. I stopped seeing Ryan's preference for younger employees as a reflection of my obsolescence and started recognizing it as evidence of his inexperience and poor judgment. By the time I walked into that conference room for the quarterly review meeting, I was not the same person who had overheard Ryan's dismissive comments about legacy employees 3 weeks earlier. I was someone who had done her homework, developed her options, and prepared for multiple scenarios regardless of what decision he made about my future with the company. I knew exactly what my severance package should include if he terminated me. I knew exactly which clients would be most interested in maintaining our relationship through alternative arrangements. I knew exactly what legal protections I had and what business opportunities were available to me. Most importantly, I knew that my professional worth was not dependent on Ryan Mitchell's opinion or Midwest Marketing Solutions' employment decisions. When he stood up to announce the organizational restructuring initiative, I was ready for whatever came next. When he delivered his speech about needing account managers who understood social media algorithms and TikTok marketing, I didn't feel hurt or surprised. I felt vindicated in my assessment of his character and confident in my preparation for this moment. And when he asked if there were any questions, I smiled because I knew something he didn't. While he had been planning to eliminate expensive employees, I had been planning to eliminate my dependence on his approval. While he had been focused on short-term cost savings, I had been developing long-term strategic advantages. While he had been underestimating my value, I had been documenting and organizing and preparing to demonstrate exactly how expensive his mistake was going to be. The restructuring announcement was not the end of my story at Midwest Marketing Solutions. It was the beginning of the final chapter, and I was going to write it myself. The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity after Ryan finished his announcement about modernization and digital transformation. I could feel the weight of 12 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting to see how I would react to being professionally executed in front of my colleagues. Some of them looked genuinely shocked. Others, particularly the younger employees who had been Ryan's early allies, seemed uncomfortable, but not surprised. A few couldn't meet my gaze at all. I closed my laptop with deliberate care, the soft click echoing in the suddenly quiet space. When I looked up, Ryan was watching me with an expression that combined smugness with barely concealed anticipation. He was waiting for the emotional breakdown that would validate his narrative about older employees who couldn't handle change. He was expecting tears, protests, or desperate attempts to negotiate that would demonstrate exactly why I needed to be eliminated. Instead, I smiled. Not the forced smile of someone trying to maintain dignity in defeat, but the genuine smile of someone who holds cards that nobody else knows about. "I appreciate the clarity, Ryan," I said, my voice steady and professional. "When would you like me to begin the transition process?" His expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation he had orchestrated. There was no begging, no emotional outburst, no satisfying moment of dominance over someone who had supposedly been holding back progress. "HR will handle the details," he replied, already moving toward the projector to begin his presentation about the future direction of account management. "We'll need comprehensive documentation of your client relationships and ongoing projects by Friday." "Of course," I said, gathering my materials with the same calm efficiency I had brought to every client meeting for 20 years. "I'll make sure everything is properly organized for whoever takes over my responsibilities." As I walked toward the door, I heard him launching into his prepared remarks about agile methodologies and customer acquisition strategies. His voice faded as I stepped into the hallway, but I could still feel the confused energy radiating from the conference room behind me. My colleagues didn't understand what had just happened any more than Ryan did. They had expected drama, and I had given them professionalism. They had anticipated resistance, and I had offered cooperation. What none of them knew was that I had been preparing for this moment for 3 weeks, and my preparation was about to become their education. The rest of Thursday passed in a strange haze of normal activities conducted under extraordinary circumstances. I answered emails, returned client calls, and attended scheduled meetings as if nothing had changed. But underneath the surface routine, I was executing a plan that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between myself and the company that had just discarded me. My first stop after leaving the conference room was Jennifer Walsh's law office downtown. I had called her that morning to schedule an emergency consultation, and she had cleared her afternoon to review the documentation I had been assembling over the past 3 weeks. Jennifer's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian mansion in Cleveland's legal district, and her conference room overlooked the courthouse where my case might eventually be decided if Ryan proved to be as stubborn as I suspected he would be. "Tell me exactly what happened," Jennifer said after I had described the morning's events. She was taking notes on a legal pad, but I could see her mind working through the implications of what I was describing. I handed her a folder containing my employment contract, performance reviews from the past 5 years, and copies of the company handbook sections I had been studying. "He terminated me for supposed restructuring purposes, but the timing and circumstances suggest this was planned, specifically to avoid paying my annual bonus." Jennifer spent 30 minutes reviewing the documents while I sat quietly, watching traffic move through the intersection outside her window. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious but encouraging. "This is stronger than I expected," she said. "The company handbook language is very specific about involuntary termination procedures, and they don't appear to have followed their own policies. More importantly, the timing of your termination right before bonus payments suggests deliberate avoidance of contractual obligations." She pulled out a calculator and started working through the numbers I had provided. "Based on your performance metrics and the bonus structure outlined in your contract, they would owe you approximately $127,000 in addition to your base severance. That's a significant financial obligation that most companies would prefer to avoid." "What are my options?" I asked. "Several," Jennifer replied. "We can demand compliance with the handbook provisions and threaten legal action if they refuse. We can file for wrongful termination based on the circumstances and timing, or we can use the leverage these obligations create to negotiate a more favorable separation agreement." I thought about this for a moment, weighing the satisfaction of forcing compliance against the practical benefits of strategic negotiation. "What would you recommend?" "It depends on your long-term objectives," she said. "If you want to maximize the financial settlement and move on cleanly, negotiation is probably the most efficient approach. If you want to send a message about how the company treats experienced employees, litigation might be more appropriate. But litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable. I made my decision quickly. Let's start with demanding compliance and see how they respond. If they refuse to honor their own policies, we can escalate from there. Jennifer nodded approvingly. I'll draft a formal letter outlining their obligations under the employee handbook and requesting confirmation of the severance calculation. Sometimes companies just need to be reminded of their own rules. While Jennifer was preparing my legal strategy, I was implementing my client relationship strategy. That evening, I composed carefully worded emails to my most important clients, messages that appeared to be routine business communications, but actually served as subtle notifications about potential changes in their account management. The message to Margaret Harrison was typical of my approach. Margaret, I wanted to touch base about our timeline for the spring campaign launch. There may be some organizational changes at MMS in the coming weeks that could affect project coordination. I'll keep you informed about any developments that might impact our work together. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to call me directly if you have any concerns about campaign progress or strategic direction. These emails served multiple purposes. They alerted my clients to potential disruptions without violating any confidentiality agreements. They reinforced my personal relationship with each client by emphasizing direct communication. Most importantly, they established a paper trail showing that I was prioritizing client interests and communication transparency, even during my own professional crisis. The responses began arriving within hours, and they were more supportive than I had dared to hope. Margaret Harrison called me at home that evening to express concern about rumors she had heard from other business owners about MMS going through changes. James Morrison sent a text message asking if I was planning to leave the company and whether he should be worried about his upcoming campaign launches. Patricia Williams forwarded me an email she had received from someone at MMS introducing himself as her new account coordinator, along with a note asking whether this meant I was no longer handling her account. These client responses confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't been certain about. My relationships with these companies were personal partnerships that extended beyond my employment at Midwest Marketing Solutions. They trusted me specifically, not just the company I worked for, and they were genuinely concerned about maintaining those relationships regardless of corporate restructuring decisions. Friday morning brought the official HR meeting that would formalize my termination and hopefully reveal how much Ryan and his team understood about their legal obligations. I arrived at the office early, spending my final hours as an employee organizing files and preparing documentation that would either support a smooth transition or demonstrate exactly how much institutional knowledge they were about to lose. Jennifer Kim from Human Resources was waiting for me in the small conference room adjacent to her office. She was relatively new to the company, hired 8 months earlier when our previous HR director had retired. Jennifer was competent and well-meaning, but she lacked the institutional knowledge to understand the full implications of what was happening. "Sarah, I want you to know how sorry I am about this situation," she began, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Your contributions to the company have been significant, and this decision wasn't made lightly." I opened the folder and reviewed the separation agreement she had prepared. 2 weeks of severance pay, accumulated vacation time totaling 3 weeks, health insurance continuation for 30 days. It was exactly what I had expected based on Ryan's understanding of company policy, and it was completely inadequate according to the actual handbook provisions. "Jennifer, I think there might be some errors in this calculation," I said calmly. She looked confused. "Errors?" "I followed the standard severance policy for involuntary termination." I pulled out my own folder, containing copies of the relevant handbook sections and my calculation of what the company actually owed me. According to Section 12.3.7 of the Employee Handbook, involuntary termination after 10 years of service requires 2 weeks' pay per year of employment. plus proportional performance bonuses for the current fiscal year. Jennifer's face went pale as she realized the magnitude of the oversight. She had been given instructions to process a standard severance package without being told to review the specific policies that applied to long-term employees. "I need to check with legal about this," she said, reaching for her phone. "Of course," I replied. "I'll wait." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in corporate panic management. Jennifer made frantic calls to the company's legal counsel, who apparently had to research the handbook provisions because nobody currently employed at the company had ever dealt with a termination of someone with my tenure and performance record. Ryan was called into emergency meetings with the executive team to explain why he hadn't considered the financial implications of his restructuring decision. The CFO had to calculate the impact on quarterly budget projections if they were forced to pay out the full severance amount. While this chaos was unfolding in conference rooms throughout the office, I sat calmly in Jennifer's office, answering emails from clients and reviewing my transition documentation. I could hear raised voices and hurried conversations echoing through the hallways, but I remained focused on maintaining my professional demeanor, regardless of whatever crisis management was happening around me. Jennifer returned to her office just before lunch, looking harried and uncertain. "Sarah, I've been instructed to tell you that we need additional time to review the severance calculation. Legal wants to examine the handbook provisions more carefully before we finalize any agreements." "I understand," I said. "Should I plan to return on Monday to continue the transition process?" "Actually, they've asked me to tell you that your access will be terminated today as originally planned, but the severance discussion will continue early next week." This was exactly what I had expected. They wanted me off the premises immediately to prevent any further client communication, but they needed time to figure out how to minimize their financial exposure. It was a reasonable strategy from their perspective, but it was also a strategic mistake that would become expensive very quickly. I packed my personal belongings methodically, taking care to remove only items that clearly belonged to me. The car, brass nameplate from my desk, the framed photos of my family, the awards and recognition certificates I had earned over 20 years, the small jade plant that had been a gift from my daughter when she graduated from high school. Each item represented memories and relationships that Ryan Mitchell could terminate my employment, but not erase. As I carried my cardboard box through the office for the last time, I noticed that several of my colleagues were watching from their cubicles and offices. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed relieved that they had been spared from the restructuring initiative. A few appeared genuinely angry about how the situation was being handled. Nobody said anything directly, but the emotional undercurrent was unmistakable. Ryan was notably absent during my departure. I later learned that he was in back-to-back meetings with the executive team, trying to explain why his cost-saving initiative was about to become a six-figure budget overrun. His absence was probably wise from a conflict management perspective, but it also demonstrated the kind of leadership style that would eventually destroy the client relationships he was so eager to modernize. That weekend, while Ryan was presumably developing contingency plans for managing my client accounts, I was implementing the next phase of my strategy. Jennifer Walsh had drafted a formal demand letter outlining the company's obligations under II, their own policies, and we planned to deliver it first thing Monday morning. But I was also taking steps to ensure that my departure from Midwest Marketing Solutions would not be the end of my relationships with the clients I had served for so many years. I spent Saturday morning reviewing the non-compete provisions in my employment contract with the kind of attention to detail that I had always brought to client campaign development. The restrictions were specific but limited. I could not directly solicit existing MMS clients for 18 months. I could not share proprietary information about company strategies or pricing. I could not recruit current employees to join a competing firm. But there were no restrictions on starting my own business in the same industry. There were no prohibitions on serving new clients who had not been MMS customers. Most importantly, there were no limits on my ability to respond to inquiries from former clients once the non-compete period expired, or even during the restriction period if they initiated contact independently. Sunday evening, I registered Chen and Associates Marketing as a limited liability company with the state of Ohio. The process was surprisingly straightforward, requiring only basic information about business purpose and registered address. I used my home address initially, knowing that I could establish a professional office location once the business began generating revenue. The business registration was more than just a legal formality. It was a psychological milestone that marked my transformation from displaced employee to independent entrepreneur. For 20 years, my professional identity had been tied to my role at Midwest Marketing Solutions. Now, I was Sarah Chen, founder and principal consultant of my own firm, with the freedom to serve clients according to my own standards rather than corporate policies determined by people who had never built a client relationship in their lives. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early November in Cleveland. I had been awake since 5, reviewing the demand letter that Jennifer would be delivering to MMS and the business plan I had been developing for my own firm. By 7:30, I was sitting in a coffee shop near my old office, watching my former colleagues arrive for what would undoubtedly be a chaotic day of damage control and crisis management. At exactly 9 o'clock, Jennifer delivered our demand letter to the MMS legal department. The letter was professional but firm, outlining the specific handbook provisions that required a substantially larger severance payment and requesting written confirmation of compliance within 48 hours. It also noted that failure to honor the company's own policies could result in legal action for breach of contract and wrongful termination. The response was swift and predictable. By 10:30, I received a phone call from David Chang, the outside employment attorney that MMS had retained to handle the situation. David was experienced and diplomatic, the kind of lawyer who specialized in resolving disputes before they became expensive litigation. Ms. Chen, I've been asked to discuss your separation from Midwest Marketing Solutions and see if we can reach a mutually acceptable resolution, he said. I understand there are some questions about the severance calculation. There are no questions from my perspective, I replied. The employee handbook is very clear about the requirements for involuntary termination after 10 years of service. I'm simply requesting that the company honor its own policies. I appreciate your position, David said carefully. However, the company is concerned about setting precedents that could create significant financial obligations for future restructuring decisions. They're hoping we can negotiate an arrangement that works for everyone. This was the opening I had been waiting for. I'm willing to discuss reasonable alternatives, I said, but any negotiation needs to start from the baseline of what I'm actually owed according to company policy. We scheduled a meeting for Wednesday morning, giving both sides time to develop negotiating positions and assess alternatives. David seemed relieved that I was open to discussion rather than immediately pursuing litigation. What he didn't realize was that negotiation was always my preferred approach, not because I was afraid of legal action, but because I had other leverage that would soon make financial settlements seem like the least of the company's problems. While David was calling me about settlement discussions, my phone was also buzzing with messages from clients who were beginning to understand that my departure from MMS was not just a routine personnel change. Margaret Harrison had received a call from someone introducing himself as her new account coordinator, a recent college graduate who apparently knew nothing about her company's history or current campaigns. James Morrison had been told that his upcoming strategy sessions would need to be rescheduled because they were evaluating the best resource allocation for his account. Patricia Williams had been informed that her retirement planning campaign would be reviewed and potentially modified to align with current best practices. These clients were not just confused about the changes in their account management. They were concerned about whether their marketing strategies would be disrupted by personnel transitions they hadn't requested and didn't understand. More importantly, they were questioning whether MMS was still the right partner for their long-term marketing needs. By Tuesday afternoon, I had received direct inquiries from 4 major clients asking about my availability for independent consulting projects. These were not solicitations that violated my non-compete agreement. They were unsolicited expressions of interest from business owners who wanted to maintain their relationship with me regardless of my employment status. Margaret Harrison was the most direct in her approach. "Sarah, I don't know what's happening at MMS, but I need to know that my marketing strategy is in good hands. If you're starting your own firm, I want to be your first client." I had to explain the legal restrictions that prevented me from accepting her business immediately, but I also made it clear that I would be interested in working with her once the non-compete period expired. In the meantime, I suggested that she request detailed transition plans from MMS to ensure continuity in her marketing campaigns. James Morrison was equally straightforward. "I've worked with 3 different marketing firms over the past 15 years, and you're the only account manager who's ever really understood my business. If MMS can't keep you, then maybe MMS isn't the right fit for me either." These conversations were both gratifying and strategically valuable. They confirmed that my client relationships were personal partnerships rather than corporate contracts. They also demonstrated that Ryan's assumption about client loyalty being transferable to younger account managers was fundamentally flawed. By Wednesday morning, when I walked into David Chang's law office for our settlement negotiation, I had a much clearer picture of the full cost of Ryan's restructuring decision. The direct financial obligation from my severance was only the beginning. The potential loss of major clients represented a revenue impact that could be 10 times larger than any personnel savings the company might achieve by eliminating my position. David's office was in one of Cleveland's modern downtown towers, with views of Lake Erie and the industrial waterfront that had defined the city's economy for more than a century. The conference room where we met was designed to intimidate, with dark wood paneling and formal portraits of distinguished-looking lawyers who had probably never handled employment disputes. David had brought Jennifer Kim from MMS Human Resources and a senior associate who would be taking notes throughout our discussion. I had brought only Jennifer Walsh, but I felt confident that we were well prepared for whatever proposals they might present. "We've reviewed the handbook provisions you cited," David began, "and we acknowledge that there may be some ambiguity about the severance calculation for long-term employees. However, we believe that the intent of the policy was to provide reasonable compensation for involuntary termination, not to create windfall payments that could destabilize company finances." Jennifer Walsh responded before I could speak. "The language in the handbook is not ambiguous. It's very specific about the calculation method and the types of compensation that must be included. If the company wanted to limit their financial exposure, they should have written different policies." We spent the next 2 hours debating the interpretation of various handbook sections and the legal enforceability of different contractual provisions. David made several settlement offers that were more generous than the original severance package, but still fell short of what the company actually owed me according to their own policies. Finally, I decided to introduce a factor that hadn't been part of the discussion yet. "David, I appreciate the time you've spent developing these proposals, but I think you should know that my departure from MMS is creating some unexpected complications with client relationships." His expression became more attentive. "What kind of complications?" "Several major clients have expressed concerns about account management transitions and have asked about my availability for independent consulting. I've explained the restrictions in my non-compete agreement, but I can't control whether they decide to seek alternative marketing services while those restrictions are in effect." The room became very quiet as the implications of what I was saying sank in. David looked at Jennifer Kim, who suddenly seemed to understand that the personnel savings from my termination might be offset by revenue losses that nobody had anticipated. "How many clients are we talking about?" David asked carefully. "I can't speak for their final decisions," I said, "but I've had substantive conversations with 4 companies that represent approximately 40% of my account portfolio." Jennifer Kim looked like she was going to be sick. Losing 40% of the revenue from my client base would transform Ryan's cost-cutting victory into a financial disaster that would be very difficult to explain to the executive team and the company's board of directors. David asked for a brief recess to consult privately with his clients. I could hear muffled conversation and what sounded like frantic phone calls from the adjoining office. When they returned, David's entire demeanor had changed. "We'd like to propose a different approach to resolving this situation," he said. "What would you think about a separation agreement that provides the full severance amount according to handbook calculations, plus additional consulting fees for helping with client relationship transitions?" This was more than I had expected, but I wasn't finished. "I'm willing to consider that approach, but I'd want the consulting arrangement to include some autonomy about how client transitions are handled. I won't participate in anything that damages relationships I've spent years building." We negotiated for another hour before reaching an agreement that exceeded my original expectations. The final settlement included the full severance amount of approximately $127,000, plus a 6-month consulting contract at my previous hourly rate to help manage client transitions. The consulting arrangement gave me significant input into how my former accounts would be handled and allowed me to maintain professional relationships during the non-compete period. More importantly, the agreement included language acknowledging my contributions to the company and expressing appreciation for my willingness to ensure smooth client transitions. It was a small victory, but it meant that my departure would be framed as a mutually respectful business decision rather than a dismissal for inadequate performance. When I walked out of David Chang's office that afternoon, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in months. I had turned a hostile termination into a generous settlement while preserving my professional relationships and maintaining my dignity throughout the process. Ryan Mitchell had tried to eliminate an expensive employee, but he had actually created an expensive problem that would cost the company far more than my salary had ever represented. But the real satisfaction was still to come. Over the following months, I would watch as Ryan's digital transformation strategy collided with the practical realities of client relationship management. I would see talented young employees struggle to maintain partnerships they didn't understand with business owners who didn't trust them. I would observe client defections, revenue shortfalls, and strategic mistakes that could have been avoided if the company had valued institutional knowledge over algorithmic optimization. Most importantly, I would build Chen & Associates Marketing into exactly the kind of firm I had always wanted to work for. A company that valued relationships over transactions, experience over innovation, and long-term partnerships over short-term profits. A place where 45-year-old marketing professionals were seen as assets rather than liabilities, and where client satisfaction was measured by trust and results rather than engagement metrics and conversion rates. The day I received the final settlement payment from Midwest Marketing Solutions, I deposited it into the business account for Chen & Associates Marketing and began planning the next chapter of my professional life. Ryan Mitchell had given me the push I needed to become an entrepreneur, but he had also given me something more valuable, the certainty that I was right about what really mattered in business, and the confidence to build a company that reflected those values. 6 months later, when my non-compete period expired and my former clients began transitioning their business to my firm, I would discover that getting fired had been the best thing that ever happened to my career. But that's a story for another day. 18 months after that humiliating conference room termination, I stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office in the West Side Business District, watching the morning sun paint Cleveland's skyline in shades of gold and amber. The view from the 28th floor of the Commerce Tower was spectacular, stretching from the lake to the industrial valleys that had shaped this city's character for generations. But what struck me most was not the beauty of the panorama, but the symbolism of where I was standing. This office, with its modern furnishings and state-of-the-art technology, represented everything I had built from the ashes of what Ryan Mitchell had tried to destroy. Chen & Associates Marketing occupied the entire 28th floor now, a testament to growth that had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. What had started as a desperate plan to survive professional assassination had evolved into something far more significant. A marketing firm that challenged every assumption about how business relationships should be built and maintained in the digital age. We had proven that experience was not obsolete, that personal connections still mattered in an algorithmic world, and that the wisdom that comes with decades of practice could not be replaced by software platforms and social media strategies. The irony was not lost on me that I was now competing directly with Midwest Marketing Solutions from an office building less than 6 blocks from their headquarters. Every morning, I could see the MMS logo displayed prominently on the building, where I had spent 20 years of my professional life. Every evening, I could observe the lights in their offices burning late as they struggled to manage client relationships with a staff that turned over every 18 months, and strategies that changed with every new digital marketing trend. The key, transformation of my own professional circumstances had been remarkable, but it was the broader impact of my story that truly surprised me. Within the Cleveland business community, my departure from MMS and subsequent success had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing cost reduction over relationship preservation. Other marketing firms had begun recruiting experienced professionals who had been pushed aside by younger managers obsessed with technological solutions. Business schools had started inviting me to speak about the importance of institutional knowledge in client service industries. Most significantly, several major corporations had revised their severance policies to ensure they didn't accidentally create the kind of expensive problem that Ryan Mitchell had handed me on a silver platter. My team at Chen & Associates now included 23 full-time employees, most of whom were experienced marketing professionals who had been discarded by firms that prioritized youth over wisdom. Margaret Wu had joined us after being pushed out of a Columbus agency that decided her 15 years of pharmaceutical marketing experience was less valuable than a recent graduate's familiarity with TikTok advertising. David Park had come aboard, following his termination from a Cincinnati firm that eliminated his position to make room for a digital native who could manage social media campaigns but had never actually talked to a client face-to-face. Linda Foster had signed on after watching her former company lose 3 major accounts because they replaced her with an algorithm that could optimize ad spend but couldn't recognize when a client was dissatisfied with creative direction. These professionals brought with them not just expertise and experience, but also client relationships that followed them from their previous employers. The pattern was becoming unmistakable across the marketing industry. Companies that eliminated experienced account managers in favor of cheaper alternatives were discovering that client loyalty was more personal and more fragile than they had realized. Meanwhile, firms like ours that valued relationship-building skills and institutional knowledge were attracting both talent and business from competitors who had made strategic mistakes similar to Ryan's. Our client roster now included 37 companies, ranging from family-owned businesses with annual revenues of $5 million to publicly traded corporations with operations across multiple states. What they shared was not industry sector or company size, but a commitment to working with marketing partners who understood that business relationships were built on trust, consistency, and genuine understanding of each client's unique challenges and opportunities. Margaret Harrison from Harrison Manufacturing had been my first client after the non-compete period expired, just as she had promised during those uncertain weeks following my termination. But her decision to transition her business to Chen & Associates had been about more than personal loyalty. She had watched MMS struggle to manage her account with a series of young coordinators who treated her family business like a case study rather than a living enterprise with 70-year history and deep community roots. The breaking point had come when her assigned account manager suggested that Harrison Manufacturing should consider rebranding with a more contemporary aesthetic that would appeal to millennial consumers. Margaret had called me that evening, barely containing her frustration. "Sarah, this kid wants me to change my company logo because it doesn't look good on Instagram." My grandfather designed that logo when he started this business in 1952. It's been on every product we've ever made, every building we've ever owned, every piece of marketing material we've ever printed, and some 25-year-old who's never built anything in his life thinks it needs to be updated for social media. That conversation had crystallized everything I had been thinking about the direction of modern marketing. The obsession with digital platforms and algorithmic optimization was causing some firms to lose sight of the fundamental truth that successful marketing must be rooted in authentic understanding of each client's identity, values, and long-term objectives. There was nothing wrong with using contemporary tools and techniques, but they should enhance rather than replace the strategic thinking and relationship building that had always been the foundation of effective marketing. James Morrison from Morrison Auto Group had followed a similar path to our firm, but his story was even more dramatic. After my departure from MMS, his account had been assigned to a team of digital marketing specialists who were convinced that traditional automotive marketing was outdated and ineffective. They had proposed eliminating his radio sponsorships of local high school football games, canceling his participation in community charity events, and replacing his relationship-based sales approach with automated lead generation systems and social media advertising campaigns. The results had been catastrophic. Morrison's customer satisfaction scores had plummeted as the dealership shifted from personal service to digital efficiency. His referral business had dried up as longtime customers felt disconnected from a company that seemed more interested in online engagement metrics than in maintaining relationships with people who had been buying cars from the Morrison family for decades. Most damaging, his reputation in the community had suffered as he reduced his involvement in local organizations and charitable activities that had defined the Morrison brand for 30 years. When James finally decided to leave MMS and bring his business to Chen & Associates, his first request was to help him rebuild the community relationships that had been the foundation of his success. We developed a comprehensive strategy that combined the best elements of digital marketing with renewed emphasis on local engagement and personal service. Within 6 months, Morrison Auto Group had recovered its previous sales levels and customer satisfaction ratings. Within a year, James was expanding into electric vehicle sales with a marketing approach that emphasized his family's commitment to environmental stewardship and community leadership. The Morrison turnaround had become a signature case study for our firm, demonstrating how experienced marketing professionals could integrate new technologies with proven relationship-building strategies to achieve results that neither approach could accomplish independently. It was exactly the kind of success story that attracted other business owners who were frustrated with marketing firms that treated every client like a generic case study rather than a unique enterprise with specific needs and circumstances. Patricia Williams from Williams Financial Services had completed her transition to Chen & Associates just 3 months earlier, bringing with her a complex retirement planning campaign that required sophisticated understanding of financial services, marketing regulations, and client psychology. Her previous experience with MMS had been particularly frustrating because the young coordinators assigned to her account kept suggesting strategies that would have violated securities regulations or alienated her target demographic of pre-retirees, who valued personal relationships over digital convenience. Patricia's success with our firm had been especially gratifying because it demonstrated our ability to serve clients in highly regulated industries where experience and expertise were not just valuable but legally necessary. Financial services marketing required nuanced understanding of compliance requirements, demographic psychology, and long-term relationship building that could not be learned from textbooks or acquired through software platforms. It was exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that companies like MMS were losing when they eliminated experienced professionals in favor of cheaper alternatives. The financial performance of Chen & Associates had exceeded every projection I had developed during those anxious weeks of planning my departure from MMS. Our first-year revenue had reached $2.8 million, driven primarily by client transitions and referrals from satisfied customers. Our second-year growth had accelerated to 4.1 million as word spread throughout the business community about our approach to relationship-driven marketing. Current projections suggested we would reach 6 million in annual revenue by the end of our third year, with profit margins that reflected our focus on high-value services and long-term client partnerships. More importantly, our employee retention rate was approaching 95%, a figure that was almost unheard of in an industry where talented professionals were constantly being poached by competitors or pushed aside by cost-cutting initiatives. Our team members stayed because they were valued for their experience, fairly compensated for their expertise, and given the autonomy to build genuine relationships with clients rather than simply executing standardized processes designed by people who had never managed accounts themselves. The contrast with MMS could not have been more stark. Industry reports indicated that their client retention rate had dropped to 67%, well below industry averages and far from the 94% we had achieved during my tenure there. Their employee turnover had increased dramatically, as experienced staff members left voluntarily rather than waiting to be eliminated by successive waves of restructuring initiatives. Most tellingly, their revenue growth had stagnated as they struggled to replace the institutional knowledge and client relationships they had carelessly discarded in pursuit of short-term cost savings. Ryan Mitchell himself had lasted only 14 months after my termination before being quietly reassigned to a non-operational role that removed him from direct involvement in client service decisions. The official announcement had described his new position as Director of Strategic Innovation, which everyone in the industry understood was corporate euphemism for being moved away from anything important while the company figured out how to terminate him without admitting that his restructuring strategy had been a complete failure. His replacement, Sarah Kim, was an experienced marketing executive with 20 years of industry experience and a track record of building successful client relationships. Her first major initiative had been attempting to recruit experienced professionals to replace the institutional knowledge that had been lost during Ryan's tenure. Ironically, several of the people she approached were now working for Chen and Associates, earning higher salaries and enjoying greater professional autonomy than they had ever experienced in corporate environments. Sarah Kim had actually called me directly 6 months after taking over Ryan's responsibilities, ostensibly to discuss potential collaboration opportunities, but obviously hoping to explore whether I might be interested in returning to MMS in some capacity. The conversation had been professional and respectful, but it had also been illuminating about the challenges she was facing in rebuilding what Ryan had systematically dismantled. "Sarah, I'll be direct with you," she had said during our lunch, meeting at a downtown restaurant that overlooked the lake. "We made serious mistakes in how we handled your departure and several other personnel decisions. We're trying to rebuild our client relationships and our internal expertise, and we could really use your help." I had appreciated her honesty and her willingness to acknowledge what everyone in the industry already knew about MMS's strategic missteps. But I had also been clear about my own priorities and professional satisfaction with the firm I had built from scratch. "I respect what you're trying to accomplish," I had replied, "but I've found something at Chen and Associates that I never had in corporate environments. The freedom to focus entirely on client success without worrying about internal politics or cost-cutting initiatives that interfere with relationship building. I'm not interested in returning to a structure where my value is constantly being questioned by people who don't understand what I do." That conversation had marked a turning point in my relationship with my former employer, transforming it from potential antagonism to professional respect. Sarah Kim and I had actually collaborated on several industry initiatives since then, including a joint presentation at the Ohio Marketing Association annual conference about the importance of balancing technological innovation with relationship preservation in client service industries. The recognition I had received within the marketing community had been both humbling and validating. The Cleveland Business Journal had featured Chen and Associates in their annual profile of fastest-growing companies, with particular emphasis on our approach to building sustainable client relationships in an increasingly digital marketplace. Marketing News magazine had published a case study about our success in serving mid-sized companies that had been underserved by larger agencies, focused on enterprise clients, or overwhelmed by smaller firms that lacked sophisticated strategic capabilities. Most meaningful had been the invitation to deliver the keynote address at the Midwest Marketing Leadership Summit, an annual conference that brought together senior marketing executives from across the region. My presentation had been titled, "Experience as Competitive Advantage: Why Wisdom Matters More Than Innovation in Client Relationship Management." The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees approaching me afterward to share their own stories about ageism in the marketing industry and their interest in joining firms that valued experience over algorithmic optimization. But the professional recognition and business success, satisfying as they were, paled in comparison to the personal fulfillment I had discovered in building something entirely my own. For 20 years at MMS, I had been constrained by corporate policies, budget limitations, and strategic decisions made by people who often had less experience and expertise than I did. At Chen & Associates, every decision about client service, employee development, and strategic direction reflected my own values and professional judgment. This autonomy had allowed me to implement innovations that would have been impossible in a corporate environment focused on quarterly profit maximization. We offered unlimited professional development budgets for team members who wanted to enhance their skills or pursue additional certifications. We provided 6 weeks of paid vacation for all employees, recognizing that sustainable high performance required genuine work-life balance. We allocated 15% of our annual revenue to pro bono work for nonprofit organizations and small businesses that couldn't afford professional marketing services, but deserved access to strategic expertise. These policies were not just expressions of personal values, but strategic investments in building the kind of company culture that attracted and retained talented professionals who had options about where to work. The marketing industry was notorious for burnout, turnover, and exploitation of young professionals who were expected to work excessive hours for inadequate compensation, while senior executives claimed credit for their creative contributions. At Chen & Associates, we had created an environment where experience was valued, creativity was rewarded, and professional development was supported rather than merely encouraged. The impact on our team's performance had been remarkable. When employees felt genuinely valued and fairly compensated, they produced work that exceeded both client expectations and industry standards. When professionals were given autonomy to build authentic relationships with clients, those relationships became sustainable competitive advantages that no algorithm or software platform could replicate. When strategic decisions were made by people with deep experience in client service, those decisions consistently supported long-term success rather than short-term cost optimization. This people-first approach had also attracted clients who were frustrated with firms that treated employees as interchangeable resources rather than valuable professionals. Business owners who had built their own companies through relationship building and strategic thinking recognized and appreciated working with marketing partners who shared those values. They understood that sustainable success required investing in human expertise rather than constantly chasing technological solutions that promised efficiency, but often delivered disappointment. The transformation of my own professional identity had been as significant as the business success we had achieved. At MMS, I had been Sarah Chen, Senior Account Director, defined primarily by my role within someone else's organization. At Chen & Associates, I was Sarah Chen, founder and principal consultant, defined by my expertise, my values, and my vision for how marketing services should be delivered in an industry that had lost its way in pursuit of digital transformation. This shift had affected every aspect of how I approached my work and my relationships with clients, employees, and industry colleagues. Instead of feeling defensive about my age and experience, I felt confident about the competitive advantages that came with maturity and institutional knowledge. Instead of worrying about adapting to new technologies, I focused on helping clients navigate technological change without losing sight of fundamental business principles. Instead of accepting that younger employees were inherently more valuable, than experienced professionals, I demonstrated daily that wisdom and judgment were irreplaceable assets in client relationship management. The evening before the third anniversary of my termination from MMS, I hosted a celebration dinner for our entire team at Lago, Cleveland's most prestigious restaurant, overlooking the lake where cargo ships still carried the raw materials that had built this city's industrial foundation. As I looked around the table at 23 professionals who had joined me in building something meaningful and sustainable, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought us all together. Margaret Wu raised her glass for a toast. 3. Years ago, most of us were considered too expensive, too experienced, or too set in our ways to be valuable in modern marketing firms. Tonight, we're celebrating the success of a company that proves experience is not a liability, but the most important asset we bring to our clients. David Park added his own perspective. What we've built here isn't just a successful business. It's proof that professionals who understand relationship building and strategic thinking can compete successfully against firms that prioritize cost reduction and technological gimmicks over genuine client service. Linda Foster concluded the toast with words that captured what we had all been thinking. Sarah didn't just start a marketing firm. She created a place where professionals can do their best work without constantly worrying about being replaced by someone younger or cheaper. That's not just good business. It's good for everyone who works in this industry. As our team continued their celebration, I stepped onto the restaurant's outdoor terrace, where the lights of the city reflected off the dark water of Lake Erie. In the distance, I could see the building where Midwest Marketing Solutions continued to struggle with the consequences of decisions made by managers who had confused innovation with wisdom and efficiency with effectiveness. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh, my attorney, who had become a close friend during the months when we had worked together to transform my termination into a strategic advantage. Saw the Business Journal article about Chen and Associates hitting $6 million in revenue. Congratulations on proving that sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to your career. Her message reminded me of something I had learned during those uncertain weeks of planning my departure from MMS. Professional setbacks were only devastating if you allowed them to define your future, rather than using them as catalysts for building something better. Ryan Mitchell had intended to eliminate an expensive problem, but he had actually provided me with the motivation and opportunity to create the career I had always wanted, but had been too comfortable to pursue independently. The severance settlement that had seemed so important during our negotiations had become almost irrelevant in the context of what I had built since then. The consulting fees and legal victories had provided helpful financial cushioning during our startup phase, but the real value had come from the confidence and clarity that emerged from successfully navigating a hostile situation through strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. Most importantly, the experience had taught me that professional worth was not determined by corporate titles, salary levels, or the approval of managers who might not understand the work being performed. Professional worth was determined by the value you created for clients, the relationships you built with colleagues, and the impact you had on the industries and communities where you worked. As I rejoined our team celebration, Margaret Harrison called me from her car, where she was driving home from a community fundraiser that Morrison Auto Group had sponsored and Williams Financial Services had supported. Sarah, I just wanted you to know that I was talking tonight with several business owners about their marketing challenges, and I mentioned Chen and Associates to at least 6 different people. I think you're going to be getting some calls next week. Her message was typical of the referral business that had become our most important source of new clients. When business owners were satisfied with their marketing partnerships, they naturally recommended those services to other entrepreneurs facing similar challenges. This word-of-mouth marketing was more valuable than any advertising campaign because it came from trusted sources who had personal experience with our work. That night, as I drove home through Cleveland's revitalized downtown district, past the converted warehouses that had become trendy restaurants, and the old industrial buildings that now house technology startups, I thought about the parallel between my own professional transformation and the broader reinvention of the city where I had built my career. Cleveland had been written off by experts who believed that industrial cities could not compete in a digital economy. But instead of abandoning their manufacturing heritage, the most successful companies had found ways to combine traditional strengths with new technologies and market opportunities. They had built on their existing foundations rather than trying to replace them entirely. Chen and Associates had followed a similar strategy, combining decades of relationship-building experience with contemporary tools and techniques that enhanced rather than replaced our core competencies. We had proven that experienced professionals could compete successfully in rapidly changing industries by leveraging their expertise rather than apologizing for it. 3 years after Ryan Mitchell had tried to eliminate me as an obstacle to progress, I had become living proof that experience was not a liability, but the most valuable asset any professional could bring to client relationship management. The severance package that had shocked them had become the foundation for building something far more valuable than any corporate position could ever provide. 5 years had passed since that cold November morning when Ryan Mitchell had attempted to erase 20 years of my professional life with a single announcement. Now, standing in the boardroom of the Cleveland Chamber of Commerce, I was being presented with the Distinguished Business Leader Award for Entrepreneurial Excellence and Community Impact. The irony was exquisite. The same business community that had witnessed my public termination was now celebrating the empire I had built from the ashes of that humiliation. The award ceremony was being held in the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental Hotel, the same venue where Midwest Marketing Solutions had hosted their annual client appreciation events during my tenure there. As I walked across the stage to accept the crystal sculpture that represented recognition from Cleveland's most influential business leaders, I could see familiar faces in the audience. Some were former colleagues who had reached out over the years to congratulate me on my success. Others were competitors who had initially dismissed Chen and Associates as a boutique firm that would never scale beyond personal relationships. Few were former clients who had become some of my most vocal advocates in the business community. The speech I delivered that evening was not about revenge or vindication, though both emotions were certainly present in my heart. Instead, I spoke about resilience, strategic thinking, and the importance of building businesses that valued human expertise alongside technological innovation. I talked about the responsibility that successful entrepreneurs had to create opportunities for others who might be facing similar challenges in an economy that often prioritized cost reduction over relationship preservation. When I was terminated 5 years ago, I said, looking out at an audience of 300 business leaders, I thought my career was ending. What I discovered was that my real career was just beginning. Sometimes the most painful professional experiences become the foundation for the most meaningful professional achievements. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with several audience members approaching the stage to shake my hand before I had even left the podium. But what moved me most was seeing Margaret Harrison, James Morrison, and Patricia Williams in the front row, applauding not just my success, but their own transformation from frustrated clients of a failing corporate structure to partners in building something sustainable and meaningful. Chen and Associates had grown far beyond anything I had imagined during those anxious weeks of planning my departure from MMS. We now employed 47 full-time professionals across offices in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, with plans to expand into Detroit and Pittsburgh within the next 18 months. Our annual revenue had reached $12.5 million, making us the third largest independent marketing firm in Ohio and one of the fastest-growing companies in the Midwest. But the financial metrics, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real measure of our success was the culture we had created and the lives we had changed, both for our employees and our clients. Our retention rate for both staff and customers remained above 90%, a figure that was virtually unheard of in an industry notorious for turnover and client churn. More importantly, we had become a destination for experienced marketing professionals who had been discarded by firms that valued youth over wisdom technology over relationships, and short-term profits over sustainable growth. The transformation of our industry had been remarkable to witness, and even more satisfying to influence. When I started Chen & Associates, the conventional wisdom in marketing was that digital natives would inevitably replace older professionals who couldn't adapt to rapidly changing technological platforms. 5 years later, that assumption had been thoroughly debunked by companies like ours that proved experience was actually more valuable than ever in helping clients navigate an increasingly complex and fragmented media landscape. The demand for seasoned marketing professionals had increased dramatically as business owners realized that managing multiple digital platforms required strategic thinking and relationship-building skills that could not be learned from textbooks or acquired through software training. Young professionals could certainly master the technical aspects of social media advertising or search engine optimization, but they struggled with the consultative approach that helped clients understand which technologies were appropriate for their specific business objectives and target audiences. This shift in industry perception had created opportunities for dozens of experienced professionals who had been pushed aside during the digital transformation craze of the late 2010s. Many of them had joined our team, bringing with them not just expertise and institutional knowledge, but also client relationships that followed them from firms that had made strategic mistakes similar to Ryan Mitchell's. Others had started their own consultancies, often with guidance and support from our team members who had successfully navigated the transition from corporate employment to entrepreneurial independence. The network of relationship-focused marketing firms that had emerged across the Midwest had become an informal alliance that shared best practices, referred clients to each other based on specialization and capacity, and collectively demonstrated that there was a sustainable alternative to the cost-cutting, technology-obsessed approach that had dominated the industry for several years. We had proven that treating employees well led to better client service, which led to stronger business relationships, which led to more sustainable revenue growth than any algorithm or automation platform could provide. Margaret Wu had become our Director of Strategic Development, responsible for expanding our services into new industry sectors and geographic markets. Her pharmaceutical marketing expertise had helped us build a healthcare practice that now served 17 medical device companies, biotech startups, and regional hospital systems. More importantly, her experience being pushed aside by a Columbus firm had made her passionate about creating opportunities for other experienced professionals who were facing similar challenges. "What we're building here isn't just a successful business," Margaret had said during our most recent quarterly review meeting. "We're creating a model that other firms are starting to copy. We're proving that companies can be profitable and growing while still treating employees like human beings rather than replaceable resources." David Park had taken on responsibility for our digital marketing services, but with a completely different philosophy than the firms that had tried to replace relationship managers with automation platforms. His approach emphasized using technology to enhance personal connections rather than replace them. His team had developed innovative ways to combine data analytics with personalized communication that helped clients build stronger relationships with their customers rather than simply optimizing conversion rates and engagement metrics. "The difference between us and our competitors," David often explained to potential clients, "is that we use technology to help you understand your customers better, not to avoid having to understand them at all. Data without insight is just noise, and insight requires human judgment that no algorithm can replicate." Linda Foster had established our nonprofit practice, providing pro bono marketing services to charitable organizations and small businesses that couldn't afford professional marketing support but deserved access to strategic expertise. This work was not just an expression of our company values, but also a smart business strategy that connected us with community leaders who often became sources of referrals and advocacy within the broader business community. The nonprofit practice had also become a training ground for young professionals who wanted to learn relationship-building skills from experienced mentors. We hired recent graduates not as cheap replacements for experienced staff, but as apprentices, who could develop their skills while contributing to meaningful projects under the guidance of seasoned professionals. This approach had created a pipeline of talent that combined technological proficiency with strategic thinking and relationship management capabilities. Our success had not gone unnoticed by our competitors, including Midwest Marketing Solutions. Ryan Mitchell had been quietly terminated 18 months after my departure, though the official announcement had described his exit as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. His replacement, and then her replacement, had struggled to rebuild the client relationships and institutional knowledge that had been lost during his disastrous restructuring initiative. The decline of MMS had been both gradual and inexorable. Client retention rates had never recovered from the mass exodus that followed my termination and the subsequent departures of other experienced professionals. Employee turnover had remained high as talented staff members left for firms that offered better compensation, greater autonomy, and more respect for their expertise. Revenue growth had stagnated as the company struggled to differentiate itself in a marketplace where their former competitive advantages had been systematically eliminated. 3 years after my departure, MMS had been acquired by a national marketing conglomerate that specialized in consolidating struggling regional firms and eliminating redundant operations. Most of the remaining staff had been terminated as part of the integration process, and the Cleveland office had been closed entirely. The building where I had spent 20 years of my professional life now housed a technology startup that developed software for managing social media advertising campaigns. The fate of my former employer served as a cautionary tale that had influenced strategic decisions at marketing firms throughout the region. Business schools had begun using the MMS case study to teach students about the importance of valuing institutional knowledge and maintaining client relationships during periods of organizational change. Industry conferences regularly featured presentations about the dangers of prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term relationship preservation. But the most satisfying aspect of our success was not the failure of our former employer, but the positive impact we had created for our employees, clients, and the broader business community. We had demonstrated that companies could grow rapidly and profitably while maintaining high ethical standards and treating all stakeholders with respect and fairness. We had proven that experienced professionals could compete successfully against firms that prioritized youth and technology over wisdom and relationships. The recognition we had received from industry organizations had been gratifying, but the real validation came from the success of our clients and the satisfaction of our team members. Harrison Manufacturing had expanded into 3 new states and doubled their annual revenue since beginning their relationship with Chen & Associates. Morrison Auto Group had become the largest electric vehicle dealer in northeastern Ohio, while maintaining their reputation for community involvement and customer service excellence. Williams Financial Services had successfully positioned Patricia for a lucrative acquisition that allowed her to retire with financial security while ensuring her clients would continue receiving excellent service. These client success stories had become the foundation of our reputation and the source of most of our new business development. When business owners were looking for marketing partners, they increasingly sought firms that could demonstrate long-term client relationships and measurable business results rather than impressive technology platforms or creative awards. We had built our entire service model around delivering both strategic expertise and personal attention that helped clients achieve their specific business objectives rather than generic best practices that might not be appropriate for their unique circumstances. The expansion of Chen & Associates into new markets had been driven primarily by referrals from existing clients who had connections in other cities. Our Columbus office had been established after James Morrison introduced us to 3 automotive dealers who were frustrated with their current marketing firms. Our Cincinnati office had opened following referrals from Margaret Harrison, who had recommended our services to several manufacturing companies in southern Ohio. Our planned Detroit expansion was being driven by referrals from clients who had business relationships in southeastern Michigan. This organic growth strategy had several advantages over traditional business development approaches. Referral clients were pre-qualified prospects who already understood our service philosophy and had realistic expectations about our capabilities. They were also more likely to become long-term partners because they had chosen us based on demonstrated results rather than sales presentations or competitive proposals. Most importantly, they became advocates for our firm within their own professional networks, creating additional opportunities for sustainable growth. The development of our leadership team had been equally organic, with senior positions filled by professionals who had demonstrated both technical expertise and cultural alignment with our values. We had never hired anyone simply because they were available or affordable. Instead, we had built our team by identifying talented professionals who shared our commitment to relationship-driven client service and providing them with opportunities to grow their skills and advance their careers within an organization that valued their contributions. This approach had created a workplace culture that attracted high-quality professionals who had options about where to work. Our employee satisfaction surveys consistently showed ratings above 90% on measures of job satisfaction, professional development opportunities, and alignment between personal values and company practices. More importantly, our team members had become ambassadors for our firm within the broader professional community, helping us recruit additional talent and build relationships with potential clients and strategic partners. The speaking engagements and industry recognition I had received had provided platforms to share lessons learned from our experience and advocate for practices that benefited the entire marketing industry. My presentations at conferences and business schools emphasized the importance of treating employees as valuable assets rather than replaceable resources, building sustainable client relationships rather than pursuing short-term revenue maximization, and integrating new technologies with proven strategic principles rather than assuming that innovation always required abandoning traditional approaches. These speaking opportunities had also connected me with other business leaders who were facing similar challenges in their own industries. The problems that had led to my termination from MMS were not unique to marketing firms. Companies across many sectors were struggling to balance cost reduction pressures with the need to maintain institutional knowledge and client relationships. The solutions we had developed at Chen & Associates were applicable to any business that depended on long-term relationships and specialized expertise. The mentoring relationships I had developed with other entrepreneurs had become some of the most rewarding aspects of my professional life. Several experienced professionals had sought my advice about starting their own firms after being pushed aside by employers who undervalued their contributions. Others had asked for guidance about building company cultures that attracted and retained talented employees in competitive industries. Many had requested insights about developing client relationships that could survive changes in technology, economic conditions, and competitive pressures. These conversations had reinforced my understanding that the challenges I had faced at MMS were part of broader trends affecting experienced professionals across many industries. The emphasis on cost reduction and technological solutions had created opportunities for entrepreneurs who understood that sustainable success required human expertise alongside digital tools. The demand for personalized service and strategic thinking had increased as business owners realized that generic solutions and automated processes could not address their unique challenges and opportunities. The evolution of my own perspective on success had been as significant as the growth of Chen & Associates. During my years at MMS, I had measured professional achievement primarily through traditional corporate metrics like salary levels, job titles, and recognition from supervisors who might not have understood the work I was performing. Building my own firm had taught me that real success was measured by the value I created for others, the positive impact I had on my community, and the satisfaction I derived from doing work that aligned with my values and utilized my expertise. The financial rewards of entrepreneurship had certainly been gratifying, but they had been secondary to the personal fulfillment that came from building something meaningful and sustainable. The opportunity to create employment for talented professionals who had been undervalued by other firms had been more satisfying than any salary increase I might have received in a corporate environment. The ability to provide excellent service to clients who appreciated and respected our expertise had been more rewarding than any performance bonus tied to metrics that might not reflect actual value creation. Most importantly, the experience of overcoming professional adversity through strategic thinking and persistent effort had given me confidence that extended far beyond business challenges. The skills I had developed in researching legal options, building strategic alliances, and communicating effectively under pressure had applications in every aspect of my life. The networks I had built within the business community had created opportunities for community involvement and social impact that would not have been available in a traditional corporate environment. The evening of the Chamber of Commerce Awards ceremony had concluded with a reception where I had the opportunity to reconnect with dozens of business leaders who had followed my journey from terminated employee to successful entrepreneur. Many of them had shared their own stories about professional challenges they had overcome through persistence and strategic thinking. Others had expressed interest in learning more about our approach to building sustainable business relationships in an increasingly digital economy. But the conversation that had meant the most to me was with a young woman named Jennifer Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who had recently graduated from Case Western Reserve University with a degree in marketing and was just beginning her professional career. She had approached me during the reception to thank me for demonstrating that experienced professionals could compete successfully in rapidly changing industries. My professors kept telling us that marketing was a young person's industry where experience was less valuable than familiarity with new technologies, she had said. Watching your success has helped me understand that there's room for both new ideas and proven wisdom, and that the best firms are probably the ones that combine them effectively. Her comment had captured something important about the legacy I hope to create through Chen & Associates and my advocacy for valuing experience alongside innovation. The goal was not to resist technological change or dismiss the contributions of younger professionals, but to demonstrate that sustainable success required integrating new tools with proven principles, fresh perspectives with institutional knowledge, and digital efficiency with human relationships. As I drove home that evening through Cleveland's revitalized downtown district, past the buildings where I had once worried about my professional future, and the offices where I now employed 47 talented professionals, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me to this point. 5 years earlier, I had believed that my career was defined by my role at a single company, and my value was determined by the approval of managers who might not understand the work I was performing. The termination that had felt like professional death had actually been professional rebirth, forcing me to discover capabilities and opportunities that I might never have explored if I had remained comfortable in a corporate environment. The severance package that had initially seemed so important had become irrelevant compared to the business I had built and the life I had created for myself and my family. The phone call I received the following morning brought the story full circle in a way that was both surprising and deeply satisfying. Michael Santos, the founder of Midwest Marketing Solutions, was calling to congratulate me on the Chamber of Commerce Award and to request a meeting about potential business opportunities. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I allowed Ryan to make decisions that destroyed everything we had built together over 20 years. I've watched your success with Chen & Associates, and I'm frankly amazed by what you've accomplished. I was wondering if you might be interested in discussing some kind of partnership or collaboration." The conversation that followed was cordial but brief. Michael explained that he had started a new consulting firm focused on helping family-owned businesses develop succession planning strategies. He was looking for marketing partners who understood relationship-driven business development and could help his clients communicate their value propositions to potential successors or acquirers. I listened respectfully to his proposal, but I was not interested in any formal business relationship with someone who had allowed personal loyalty to cloud his judgment about strategic decisions that affected dozens of employees and clients. However, I was willing to provide informal advice about building sustainable business relationships both as a courtesy to someone who had given me opportunities early in my career and as an expression of the professional values that had guided my success at Chen & Associates. "Michael, I appreciate you reaching out," I replied, "and I wish you success with your new venture. But I think we both understand that our approaches to business development are fundamentally different. You're welcome to call if you need specific advice about client relationship management, but I'm not interested in any formal partnerships." That conversation had provided closure to a chapter of my professional life that had remained emotionally unresolved despite my obvious success in moving beyond it. Michael's acknowledgement of the mistakes that had been made validated my decision to leave MMS and build something better, while his request for partnership confirmed that the business model we had developed at Chen & Associates was recognized as superior even by people who had initially dismissed it. The 5-year anniversary of my termination arrived 2 weeks later, marked not by any public recognition, but by a quiet celebration with my family at the same Italian restaurant where my husband and I had eaten dinner on the night I was fired. The contrast between that evening of uncertainty and anxiety and this evening of satisfaction and optimism perfectly captured the transformation that had occurred in every aspect of my professional life. My daughter, now graduated from Northwestern and working as a social impact consultant in Chicago, had driven home for the weekend to join the celebration. Over dinner, she had asked me what lessons I hoped she would learn from watching my journey from corporate employee to successful entrepreneur. "The most important thing," I had told her, "is that your professional worth is not determined by other people's opinions about your value. It's determined by the results you create, the relationships you build, and the positive impact you have on the people and communities you serve. When someone tells you that you're too expensive, too experienced, or too set in your ways, use that as motivation to prove them wrong by building something better than they ever imagined." As I sat in that restaurant, surrounded by the people who had supported me through the most challenging period of my professional life, I realized that the termination that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning. The career I had built at Chen & Associates was more fulfilling, more financially rewarding, and more aligned with my values than anything I could have achieved by remaining in a corporate environment that didn't appreciate my contributions. The severance package that had shocked them 5 years earlier had been the foundation for building something that shocked them even more. A business that proved experience was more valuable than innovation. Relationships were more important than algorithms, and treating people well was the most effective strategy for sustainable success in any industry. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.